Hello, I'm Northwest Coast native artist David Neal, and this is the story of Bukwis, the chief of the ghosts. Property Body was the son of a chief, and he was in love with a young woman from a nearby village. Her name was Calling Tribes, and her father was the chief of that community. Every evening, after he had finished work for the day, he paddled his cedar canoe to go see her. Their parents intended for them to be wed, and they allowed them to visit regularly. "Early in the morning I'll go hunting seals, and I'll be gone until long after dark, so tomorrow I won't be able to visit you, my love," Property Body said one evening. "You'll be exhausted after a long day of hunting," Calling Tribes replied. "You get some rest, and I'll see you the day after." "I'll see you in 2 days then," Property Body said. The next evening, Calling Tribes was working on a cedar root basket in her bedroom when she heard a soft knocking on the wall outside. Her heart leapt, and she thought that her beloved had come back early. "Darling, is that you?" she whispered through a crack in the boards. "It's me," the voice said. "Come outside, my love." Calling Tribes was overjoyed that her beloved Property Body had returned early, and she rushed outside to see him. It was a moonless night, and she could barely see as she felt her way along the side of the big house. "Darling, where are you?" she said. "I couldn't wait to see you," the voice said. "I came to take you to my village, darling." "To your village?" Calling Tribes replied. "We've never gone to your village together." "Don't you trust me?" said Property Body. "I trust you, darling," Calling Tribes said hesitantly. "Then get a blanket to keep yourself warm and come to my canoe," he said. Calling Tribes got a marten skin blanket from her house and sat in the bow of the canoe. Property Body paddled away from the village, keeping close to the shore. "I'll be paddling for some time, my dear, so why don't you try to get some sleep," he said. Calling Tribes immediately felt drowsy and fell into a deep slumber. As soon as she was asleep, the canoe changed course and headed out to the open sea. It was still dark when she awoke, and she saw that they were approaching a village. There was no one in sight, and the houses appeared to be normal, but she felt that something wasn't right. They landed, and Property Body pulled the canoe above the high water line and helped her out of the canoe. Then, without a word, he walked towards the big house and motioned for her to follow. "Sit by the fire at the rear of the house," he said brusquely. He added wood to the fire, and then he left the house without saying a word. Calling Tribes began to wonder if this was actually Property Body, because he was acting very odd. As the sun rose and the night faded, the walls of the house began to shimmer, and then became transparent. At first it seemed that she could see through the walls to the beach in the distance. Then she imagined that she could see blue skies and clouds overhead. Calling Tribes thought that her eyes were deceiving her. Then suddenly the walls and the roof disappeared. The house was gone. She found herself sitting on the bare ground with just a few smoldering embers in front of her. Calling Tribes was astounded. She searched the beach and the forest near the house, looking for Property Body. But she was all alone. There was no houses, no canoes, and no village. She sat on the ground where the house had stood and cried for a long time. As darkness fell, the house returned. She found herself sitting in the big house once more, with a fire blazing in the center. A man entered the house shortly after dark, but his appearance was different. He no longer looked like her beloved Property Body. "I'm back, mistress," he said. "Who are you?" Calling Tribes asked fearfully. "I am the wild man of the woods. I am the chief of the ghosts," he replied. "Your people know me as the Bukwis, and I brought you here to be my wife." "Where are we?" she said. "This is the country of the ghosts, where the souls of those who have drowned come to rest," Bukwis said. Calling Tribes was speechless and began to cry. Bukwis seemed not to notice and said, "You must be hungry. What would you like to eat, my dear?" "Where I come from, we like to eat halibut," Calling Tribes replied. Bukwis took a rope of twisted cedar roots and left the house. Calling Tribes followed him, lest she be left sitting alone in the house when it disappeared again. Without pausing, Bukwis walked into the sea and disappeared beneath the dark water. Calling Tribes thought this very strange, but then everything had been strange since she had left her village. She sat down on a piece of driftwood and waited. It wasn't long until Bukwis emerged from the water, pulling 4 large halibut behind him. "I have brought these halibut for you, my dear," said Bukwis. Calling Tribes smiled weakly and tried to look appreciative. Then Bukwis came to her and held her close. His body was as cold as ice, with no inner warmth at all. At that moment she realized that she was truly the chief of the ghosts. When the sky began to brighten in the east, Bukwis went outside without telling her where he was going. As the sun peeked over the eastern horizon, Colin Travis found herself sitting in the bare ground, and the house was gone again. She walked down to the beach and found a large mussel, and she used its shell to cut up the halibut. Then she walked into the woods and found a wind-blown cedar and collected the bark and some limbs. Colin Tribe used this to make a rough shelter, and then she made a fire from the few remaining embers and cooked the halibut. As the fish began to cook, the aroma reminded her that she hadn't eaten for days. She was ravenous. After a long, lonely day, the sky began to darken, the night fell, and the big house returned. Calling Tribe found herself sitting in the middle of the big house once again. Bukwis entered and laughed when he saw the shelter that she had built. "Why do you make a hut of cedar scraps when you sit inside of a big house?" he asked her. "I know you don't see the house during the day, but it still protects you. If it rains, the water won't touch you. And if the wind blows, you won't feel it, my dear." "You leave me during the day, and the house is nothing but a grassy place near the beach," Colin Tribe scolded. "So I built this little house and a fire to cook my halibut." "We have a house already," Bukwis replied stubbornly. "Try some of my halibut," Colin Tribe said as she offered him a cooked piece of fish. "It's very tasty." "I don't eat that food," Bukwis said as he shook his head and turned away. Colin Tribe, not one to quarrel with her new husband, said, "I will try to eat your food then." "That's great, my dear," Bukwis replied. Then he got up and left the house. Soon, two young men came in carrying a piece of hemlock bark, which they put down in front of Colin Tribe. She saw that it held a roast sockeye salmon. She was still hesitant to eat, and then Bukwis returned. He sat down beside her, and he took a piece of salmon and ate. "This fish is delicious," Bukwis said. "Won't you try some, my dear?" Colin Tribe picked up a piece and tasted it. It was indeed delicious, so she ate more. "Now you are truly my wife," Bukwis said, after they had eaten their fill. "You have eaten my food, and now I truly possess your heart." "I don't understand," Colin Tribe replied. "You've eaten our food. Now you're one of us," said Bukwis. "No longer will the house disappear in the daytime. Now you cannot go home, and you will live here forever with my people, the ghosts." "No!" Colin Tribe shrieked as she got to her feet. "I won't stay here. I must return to my people." "You're mine now, my dear," Bukwis said smugly. "You'll never go home." Colin Tribe ran towards the door, only to find that she couldn't go through it. Earlier that day she had simply walked through, but now it was as if there was no door there. She pounded on the boundary where there had previously been a door and sobbed. "You'll get used to living here," Bukwis said with a sly grin. "Everyone does. Eventually." I hope you found the story of the Bukwis, the chief of the ghosts, interesting. He is a key figure in Kwakwakwa'wakw stories. His masks and the dances are still used in our Kwakwakwa'wakw potlatches in the big houses today. I think this is in part because the striking Bukwis masks and the dance that accompanies it. This mask and the dance is still seen in our potlatches today. It's a very common one. Now the Bukwis is the Kwakwakwa'wakw version, and the Wild Man of the Woods is the English translation. Now, the translation of the names can be difficult. Now, the two main characters, Property Body and Calling Tribes, are translations obviously into English. The names can be very long in Kwakwakwa'wakw. It's based on prefixes and suffixes. Sometimes you'll end up with very long names or difficult translations. Now, the abduction is a recurring theme that you see in Kwakwakwa'wakw legends and actually stories all up and down the northwest coast. Sometimes the result is good and sometimes bad. More often than not, the results are good. They are taken away and given supernatural treasures, supernatural powers, names, and even supernatural weapons. The other thing that's common you'll see is shape-shifting and assuming other identities. Many of the characters do this, and tricking other people into getting what they want is often what they're after. The land of the ghosts is one of many supernatural lands, the sky world, the undersea world. All of these are places that are much like our world, with all the different attributes of a realm, of another world. The other thing you'll see in this story that is very typical is being tricked into eating food. You'll see this in legends all over the northwest coast, where the person is tricked into eating the food and then they can never return home. Now, those are a few things I wanted to point out about this story to help you better understand it. The Northwest Coast legends have recurring themes and sometimes cultural references, and sometimes the translations don't work out
precisely. So I want to add this in so to help you better understand our culture. Thank you for listening. Gaila Kesla.